How did you get interested in the Kennedy assassination?
I was in graduate school in 1974 when the Watergate things were coming to the fore, and the Senate hearings were being led by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. And so a friend of mine who knew that I was following it very closely said, if you're interested in Watergate, if you think that's interesting, you should read this book on the Kennedy assassination. And he gave me the book A Heritage of Stone by the New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. And it literally turned my thinking around. I had never even thought that there was a controversy before, much less what the controversy might be and what the answer might be. And that's what got me started.
What is your assessment of the Warren Commission's investigation?
I think it left a lot to be desired. I can't look into men's minds, all of whom are now deceased, to know exactly what their motivations were, but it feels like that they had a dead lone gunman and they were trying their very best to put everything onto him at that point, knowing there would never be a trial and no one could ever come along and say, oh, well, no, this needs to be put into evidence. Also, I think that the leadership of the country at the time was very much afraid that Oswald may have been, as he kind of appeared, a pro-communist sympathizer, and if he were working for the Soviet Union or Cuba, that finding that out might mean the beginnings of war, which could lead to World War III. And I know that Lyndon Johnson was very concerned about that. So it seems to me that they had their ready scapegoat, and that's whom they wanted to pin the blame on.
And I've investigated myself the various personalities involved with the Warren Commission, and the one that seemed to cover, who did not seem to do much what I call thorough research, and you would expect that being a former CIA director, but former CIA Director Dulles. Can you comment on his role in the investigation?
I will say this. I found it extremely interesting once I discovered who the members of the Warren Commission were and what their background was, that the new president, Lyndon Johnson, appointed the man that John Kennedy fired from heading up the CIA for lying to him, appointed him to the Warren Commission to tell the truth about Kennedy's death. I have always found that extremely unusual and remarkable in every sense of the word.
Now, once you decided to take on the investigation of the Raleigh call, who was the first person that you contacted?
Anthony Summers, because it was in reading Tony Summers' book called Conspiracy in 1980 that I first discovered that Oswald had attempted to place a call to area code 919. I recognized after a few seconds that yes, that was my hometown area code, Raleigh, North Carolina, and I wanted to know what it was all about. So I called him, talked to him, arranged an interview, and that started it.
Did you, at what point did you look into, what did Mr. Summers have to say?
Well, it was very interesting. When I talked to him and told him what I wanted to discuss with him, he said, oh, well, I'm very happy to talk to you. He was an extraordinarily nice man, but he said, that's the one thing in my book I wish I had not put in there. And I said, why? He said, well, I've looked at it since then, and it just doesn't seem to hold up. It doesn't seem right. I don't have backup facts. I just wish I hadn't put it in, whether it's right or wrong. Wish I hadn't put it in. And I said, well, thank you very much. And about a week later, I got a call back from him, which I thought was remarkable also. And he said, I've changed my mind. He said, I just had a conversation with Robert Blakey, who was, of course, chief counsel for the House Assassinations Committee. And he said, I told him what I told you, that I wish I hadn't put it into the book. And he said, I think you're exactly wrong. Blakey told him, he says, it is a real thing. It actually happened. The call was intended to go out from Oswald to someone out there. We think it's real. We think it's disturbing. We don't understand the ramifications, but it really did happen. And that's what changed Tony Summers' mind.
At what point did you contact John Hurt?
When I called my editor to see if he wanted me to write this up, he gave me about a week and a half deadline to get it in. So I called John Hurt probably 2 or 3 days after I had done the initial research and gotten the facts behind me. and talked to him that one time. I was able to record the conversation, so that is in the archives of the publication that printed my articles, and that was the basis of where we went from there.
What is your assessment of Mr. Hurt?
I first talked to Mrs. Hurt. She's the one that answered the phone, and she seemed, well, first of all, neither one of them, it was clear I was not the first journalist to contact them. They had been bothered quite a bit as a result of this information coming forward. And she seemed, of the two, much more nervous, as if something bad would happen to them if they talked about whatever it was that they were supposed to know and maybe didn't know or whatever. And so she questioned me very, very carefully, and but did finally put her husband on the phone. He seemed somewhat disoriented at the time. This was 1980, and he would die the following year, so he was not in good health. He seemed a little disoriented at first, but he knew why I was calling, and he said that he had not placed a call, he had not received a call. He said he professed great admiration for President Kennedy and said that rather than talking to Oswald, he would have felt more inclined to have killed Oswald himself. And that was the sum and substance of what he said. He didn't do it. I confirmed with him that he had been a special agent in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps in World War II. He was very forthright about that, and had ended his career with the Army in 1947.
Did he indicate who he associated with the last 2 years between 61 and 63?
I'm sorry?
Did he indicate some of his personal or business contacts between 1961 and 1963?
I'm not sure that he had any real business contacts at that point, that late, because he had gone on full disability in 1955. He had psoriatic arthritis, which resulted in the amputation of several of his fingers. He had been diagnosed with various psychological maladies, including paranoid, schizophrenic, and he simply was not able to work. The last job he seems to have held was with the North Carolina Department of Motor Vehicles, and an arrangement was made for him to leave that job so they wouldn't have to dismiss him because he apparently was just not able to do the job.
What were some of the, as a researcher, I know some of the process, and you hit a source and realize it's unreliable, and then you hit another source and it possibly is reliable, but there's absolutely nothing to support it. At what point did you find something that you went, this is worth pursuing?
I can tell you exactly when that happened. When the switchboard operator who was there in the room when Oswald attempted to make the call, when she was finally tracked down, and which didn't happen until 1968, she had confided to a friend that she had witnessed that. He told the local sheriff in Missouri at that time. She had moved to Missouri. He listened to the woman's story, said, "This is credible. Maybe you'd like to tell the FBI that because it's federal. It's not local." FBI came and interviewed her, and somewhere along the line, around 1968 or very shortly thereafter, a document appeared, and we have no idea who created the document, but somebody who had listened to this woman, her name was Mrs. Treon, someone who had listened to her tell the story in great detail, which could have been the sheriff, could have been the FBI, typed up an affidavit, a 2.5-page legal-size affidavit, telling her story. That document remained unsigned and therefore unnotarized, but it still existed. When the House Assassinations Committee began its work in 1977, the document had found its way to the archives of the Assassination Archives and Research Library, and one of their executives sent a photocopy of that document to the House Assassinations Committee, thinking that they would want to pursue it, and they did. They spent about a year researching it. And one of the things they did, and now I'm going to answer your question because this is the moment I felt like we had something really true. They interviewed Mrs. Treon and told her a few of the things that had been in the affidavit because she had never seen the affidavit. She said, no, that's not right. So they sent her a photocopy of the affidavit and said, please correct the things in it that are wrong and tell us if you ever signed it. And she said, no, I never signed it. I would never have signed anything that had these errors in it. I have a copy of the document that she hand wrote her corrections in and her additions. And once you change the document to reflect the things that she said are really true and what she told the FBI, it all makes sense at that point. All the things that seem self-contradictory or contradictory to other things or might have pointed to some other description or reasoning for how it happened, they all fell away, and it became an absolute clear document of what she believed to be the truth, and I found her to be very truthful.
And what did the corrected document indicate?
Okay. It was a fascinating story. She had come in early to work that night to relieve someone who wanted to get off early. It was around 10:30 in the evening. She was told by the higher level operator who was still on duty until 11 o'clock that night that she'd been told that Oswald was going to want to make a phone call and that it would come through the switchboard. And before that happened, two men would come to the switchboard room and would want to monitor the call. Well, sure enough, around 10:30, a little thereafter, knock on the door, two men in suits, not uniforms, came in, identified themselves, and were put into the adjoining utility rooms where they were able to listen in on whatever came through. A couple of minutes later, light lit up from the jail indicating that Oswald was trying to make the call. Both ladies plugged into the switchboard at exactly the same time and turned their keys on, so they both were able to listen in. Mrs. Treon said, "Number, please," first, but then stopped and let the senior lady take the call because she had been the one told that it was going to come.
And the senior lady's name was?
Mrs. Louise Swinney. And Mrs. Swinney took the information that Oswald had given her about who he wanted to call. And Mrs. Treon also was writing the information down because she had wanted to keep a souvenir of something so historic and so momentous. So she wrote down all of the information that Oswald said about the call that he wanted to make. Mrs. Swinney at that point turned the key off of Oswald and called in to the two men, listened to them, told them what happened, who he wanted. She came back, she closed the key for them, and according to Mrs. Treon, sat there very nervous and shaking, and finally opened the key back up to Oswald and said, "I'm sorry, no one answered at that number," without ever having tried to make the call. Mrs. Swinney left her job, or left her shift that night at 11 o'clock, and Mrs. Treon kept that little slip where she'd written all the information on there, literally until 1968 when she told her friend about having witnessed it. The FBI took the slip, made some copies, gave it back to her, and from that point on, that's the story as she corrected it.
Tell us some other findings that you later on in some of your other research.
Well, when all we had was the uncorrected affidavit, which the corrected one didn't emerge as declassified from the House Assassinations Committee until fairly recently.
But you had a copy of it.
I had a copy of the uncorrected, but I didn't have a copy of the corrected one until probably 2 or 3 years ago.
And that's when they released it.
That's right, and it came available through the National Archives.
Why do you think they were hiding it all these years?
Everything from the House Assassinations Committee was marked classified, put into storage boxes, and stored in the National Archives for, I believe it was to be another 75 years, 50 or 75 years before anything could be looked at. During the Clinton administration, Congress passed a law and the President signed a law opening up all of those and declassifying them immediately. Well, that was in 93 or 94, and they're still very slowly, very, very slowly, I mean, this is 20 years ago, taking out document by document by document, and it's slowed down to a real trickle. But to go back to your original question, when all I had to go on was any of us had to go on was the uncorrected one. The uncorrected one said that Mrs. Swinney had written down the information, and when the call didn't go through, tore it off, put it in the trash can, and that later, when Mrs. Swinney left, Mrs. Treon reached into the trash can and got it. And so that led several people, including some very excellent researchers who otherwise are really right on the ball, to speculate that maybe it was a crank call coming in from the outside, maybe from someone named John Hurt, maybe from someone claiming that name, or that Mrs. Swinney had torn off the piece of paper about that call, but the thing that Mrs. Treon had found was something about something totally different. We now know that, A, she didn't do any trash can diving, and she was very offended that anyone would have written up that's what she did. She says, no, I heard it with my own ears. I heard Oswald's voice say it, and I wrote it down contemporaneous. So we all had false information to go on at the time that we only had the original affidavit.
And why do you think the information was falsified?
It could have just been a mistake. Somebody could have looked at their notes, and it doesn't seem like on the face of it, because it's procedural. Did she listen? Did she get it out of the wastebasket? It's not like they changed something important like the man's name or his cell phone number. They left those the same. I think it was just somebody was typing up the affidavit from maybe the notes that the FBI people had made and read it wrong, or they wrote it down wrong at the time or something.
So that was my next question, the unedited document.
Mm-hmm.
What is substantially different between it and the corrected document?
Well, the main thing is about how she got the information, is that she heard it and wrote it down at the same time, as opposed to going to the trash can to find it. There were a few other minor things, such as the timing as to what happened when, but they were very minor compared to that piece of information about how she got the information, that she heard it herself. And that, to me, as I said earlier, that's the thing that flipped the domino for me from I believe she's credible to I'm absolutely positive she's credible now.
I didn't know Mrs. Treon, but I knew Mrs. Swinney. And I found her to be, now at the time that I knew her, I was with the city of Dallas. And I worked with her, I won't say on a close basis, but I probably had contact with her about once a week.
Mm-hmm.
And I found her to be a kind of a old-fashioned kind of Texas girl.
Mm-hmm.
I found her to be, what you want, hon? That kind of thing.
Right.
And so I have no reason to think that she ever lied.
Right. I don't think either one of them did.
And nevertheless, I can see how she got nervous, because she was an old-fashioned country girl. Mm-hmm. She wasn't used to men in suits with guns on.
Right.
Now, how did that, once the domino fell, how did that lead you to other findings?
Well, that just sort of confirmed all my major findings I had already done by the time I finally got the corrected one. And that just said, okay, all this information that you've gotten, all the conclusions that you've drawn are probably right now that you've got this. What I did next was, again, with the help of the publisher of the articles, we started casting our nets a little bit broader to find out why would someone who was in counterintelligence during World War II have been on the radar screen of Lee Oswald, regardless of whether he was a lone nut assassin or whether he was working with someone else? What would be the key to making John David Hurt, the one that he would want to call? We talked to a man by the name of Victor Marchetti, who was case officer for many years with the CIA. When he left, he wrote the first book that was ever submitted to pre-publication censorship in the United States by the CIA, who wouldn't let him publish some of the things in there. So his credibility was high. We got in touch with him. We explained what we had discovered. He had not heard any of this before. And he said, I'll tell you exactly what was going on. He said it was classic spycraft. Someone told Oswald, if you ever get in trouble, don't call me. Don't try to get in touch with me directly. Call, let's say, John Hurt in Raleigh, North Carolina. He will then know who you are, and he will contact me, and that way I'll know you're in trouble. And he said that's classic spycraft. It's called using a cutout, and he explained all of it to us, and he said that's exactly what was going on. And we said, do you have any reason to believe that Oswald may have been used by or be a member of American intelligence? And he said, well, you know, in the late 50s, when Oswald was in the Marines, the Office of Naval Intelligence was running a defection school down on Nag's Head in North Carolina, where they were recruiting young disaffected men and training them to defect to the Soviet Union in the hopes that they would be picked up as intelligence agents over there, and then the United States intelligence could be feeding the Russians bad information. And he says, I have no doubt whatsoever, given the fact that he was a good Marine, and then all of a sudden he's a communist and he's defecting. He says that's exactly what they taught the people to do there. He said, so Oswald most likely passed through Nag's Head on his way to do that in Russia.
Now, I might be wrong, but when I read the Marchetti story, there was a suggestion that once Oswald called him John Hurt, that it kind of sealed the fate.
Well, what he said in his interview was, we gave him a hypothetical situation, not necessarily Oswald's, but it was close. And I said, well, what if you're in really, really bad trouble and they don't want to have anything to do with you and you call your cutout? Are you screwed? And he says, no, you're dead. Now, we didn't specifically apply that to Oswald, but you can draw whatever conclusions you want, and I think he was probably thinking along those lines.
Well, I have a reliable source that told me that once Oswald said, I am a patsy, he was dead. And so there seems to be, and this person is pretty reliable, there seems to be a body of thinking that suggests, using the, what do they call it? Statistics. I used to call it statistics. Correlation coefficients rather than causation. There's a body of evidence that suggests because Oswald started appearing to be indicating by the calls he made and some of the statements he made, he was going to talk. That the decision was he was dead. Somebody was going to get him one way or the other.
And I've heard that as well. Maybe not from the sources that you've heard it from, but it's certainly something that's been discussed. Also, that it was part of the plan all along. That if they needed to use Oswald as a patsy and ultimately did so, that was part one of the plan, and part two was that he wouldn't live through the weekend.
Now back to Marchetti, because that's a very strong statement. Did he elaborate on why Oswald would be dead?
No, as I said, we didn't apply it specifically to Oswald. He made it pretty clear that he didn't want to talk specifics. He was willing to say because of the defection to Russia that was pretty clear that he must have passed through the ONI Nag's Head thing. But he really didn't want to talk specifics and be quoted. And we told him we're going to be quoting you, so whatever you say, please know that we will quote you.
So he was careful about what he said.
I think he was, exceptionally.
But the fact that he was willing to say, in a general sense, the fact that Oswald called this Hurt sealed his fate.
Yeah, he said, that's what he was doing. He had been told that if you get caught or get into any kind of trouble, this is how we will come and get you out, whether we intend to or not.
Well, he had to have been in a desperate state psychologically.
Yes.
And he was not a stable person to start with.
Every indication is that he was increasingly troubled and then nervous and then anxious and then scared for what was happening to him.
Now, did any of your research, did you come across can it be proven that Oswald made any calls subsequent when he was leaving the depository, got on the bus? Did he stop anywhere to make any phone calls that we know of?
No one has ever ascertained that. And about the only place he could have done that was once he got back to his rooming house. But his landlady did not indicate that he even had time for that. He basically came in, changed jackets, I believe she said, and then left the house again. So there's no indication from her or anyone else that a call like that was made. Now there is an indication, and Mark Lane was actually the first one to uncover this, so this has been out since 1965 when Rush to Judgment came out, that eyewitnesses at the place of the Tippit shooting, Officer Tippit of the Dallas police, was killed not that far from Oswald's rooming house, and it was assumed that day that Oswald did it. That there were eyewitnesses who lived in that Oak Cliff neighborhood who saw where the police car was, that there were two men actually there, and the description of one witness in particular described a young, slender man and an older, paunchy, as she put it, chunky kind of guy, which sounds like someone we know.
Yeah, me.
And me. But probably more likely someone like Ruby, or someone built like Ruby.
There is...
And I might add that same witness said, when you saw the chunky man, when you saw the slim man, what was he doing? She said he just kept walking down the street. And what about the chunky man? And she said, he said, what was he doing? And she said, he was unloading and reloading his gun. And there's videotape of her saying that. And her name is Mrs. Aquila Clemens, and she was extremely brave to come forward and say that, because she had been warned by people she believed to be police officials never to say anything about what she saw. But she did to Mark Lane.
Did you uncover any evidence of Oswald's, besides what you just told me, association with Oswald, with Ruby?
Well, yes. There is the indication that there's two things that I have come across. One is in a book published, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, by a woman named Judith Vari Baker, who claimed to have had a relationship with Oswald in New Orleans in the summer before the assassination, that she, while in the company of Oswald, saw a man she later determined to be Jack Ruby several times. And that's one instance, unconfirmed, unproved, but a witness statement which says that. And then there is the indication that Jack Ruby introduced to one of his employees inside his club, sitting at a table having drinks, introduced her to a man that he said was Lee Oswald of the CIA. And that, again, goes along and is one more account that indicates that Oswald and Ruby at least crossed paths, if not were working together.
What is the most single compelling evidence that there might have been a conspiracy?
That may be one of the best questions I've ever been asked. I look at it this way. If you believe that the physical evidence that people like Mark Lane accrued about the sound of where the shots came from and the number of shots, and could all the damage have been done by the number of shots and the magic bullet and all those kinds of things that will get you into the minutiae of things that you can really get lost in. If you have any reason to believe that something like that may be true and that someone else might have been involved, or if you just believe that the House Assassinations Committee was right when they said there was another shooter that day firing from somewhere near the grassy knoll, I think it's absolutely mind-blowing that on the same page, in the same paragraph, right after they make that admission, they say, but of course we can't rule out the possibility of coincidence of two people who didn't know each other firing at the same time in the same place. But if you have any indication whatsoever that Oswald might have been working with someone else, I've said for quite some time now, and it's led my thinking along, I think, the right lines, then what you should do is look at Oswald's life for the 2 years or so prior, after he got back from the Soviet Union, and find out who he associated with. George de Mohrenschildt, who had CIA connections. Ruth Payne, who reportedly had similar kinds of connections, and in whose rooming house he and his wife lived. The people that he ultimately surrounded himself with when he was in New Orleans. and the organized crime people there, and the anti-Castro Cubans that he interacted with there. If you want to know with whom he may have formed a conspiracy or been brought into an existing conspiracy, you need to look at who he hung out with. And those are the people that are more often than not looked at as the possible groups that might have done the assassination. So that, to me, again, to use that previous metaphor, that was the thing that knocked the domino over and said, all right, I'm not going to say these groups did it, but if tomorrow someone proved that these groups did it beyond a question of a doubt and everybody believed it, I wouldn't be surprised, because the evidence does point in that direction.
Is there any, did you uncover any evidence that possibly Vice President Johnson was a potential target?
I think that, I'm going to give a very blank statement here to begin with. I think that Lyndon Johnson was involved in some way. Now, a target, I think he thought he might have been a target. There's some indication that in the car that he was in, he was making kind of moves to try to keep his head out of the way. There are, of course, people who believe that he was part of the assassination conspiracy. I have not seen enough evidence at all to indicate that he was part of the people planning it. I have seen a pretty good amount of evidence to indicate that he had knowledge of it ahead of time, including things that he told to people in his close circle, like the day or the day before the assassination, telling someone who was very close to him that very soon he wouldn't have those damn Kennedys to worry about anymore. Some thought he was talking about after the '64 election, but I think he was probably talking more about the next 48 hours. So I think his major role in this, however, was the formation of the Warren Commission and of most likely channeling that group toward the ultimate conclusions that they came to.
I personally don't think Lyndon Johnson had any planning to do with it.
Right.
But it has raised a suspicion that the Lyndon Johnson School in Austin has kept vaults of information sealed. And everybody riding in the car that day is now dead. The Warren Commission is now dead. Why are we still sealing these documents?
Earl Warren said, we won't know in our lifetime. And Earl Warren was right about a lot of things.
And this is common knowledge, but when President Johnson asked him to be on to form a commission, what was his initial response?
Well, he didn't want to. Apparently, the first overture came by telephone or something similar. I don't know if he wrote him or phoned him, but I believe he phoned him and asked if he would be willing to do it for his country. And he said, I don't think that's the right thing for the Chief Justice to do. I think this is the blurring of the lines of separation of the powers and so forth. And so at some point, Johnson got Chief Justice Warren to come into the Oval Office, into a private meeting, just the two of them. And people who were there had remarked that when the Chief Justice emerged from that meeting, he was very ashen-faced and looked struck dumb at whatever had just happened. And it was immediately after that that he said that he had changed his mind and would take over the chairmanship of the commission.
Is there any answers that you would like to give to the questions I didn't ask? I haven't asked the most obvious. Who do you think did it? Because I know your answer. You don't know.
I don't know, and even if I thought I did, I wouldn't speculate.
Right.
If I knew, then that would be a different question. I don't, and no one really does unless they were involved in it. So that's you correctly say, that is a moot question. The second most frequent question I get asked, however, is, do you think we'll ever know? And it occurred to me and to a friend of mine who co-authored one of my articles with me, to think that, to answer it this way, how do we know that someone hasn't come up with the right answer and put it into a book? Someone did their research and interviewed exactly the right people and put the right things together and came up with the right conclusion, put it as one of the conclusions in that book, sitting on a library of dozens and hundreds and maybe even thousands at this point of books and monographs and articles, each putting out a slightly different theory. how do we know that one of them hasn't gotten it right? The press has completely abrogated their responsibility for being the judge of these things and saying this one makes sense, this is high scholarship, this one is poor scholarship and shouldn't be out there and shouldn't be considered. This person failed to do this, but this person did it right. Press has completely wiped that out of their responsibility, and more importantly, they've wiped out the responsibility of they themselves going out and trying to do investigation the way they did in Watergate. They're the ones responsible for breaking Watergate, not the United States government Justice Department. They have not done that for the Kennedy assassination, and so I think that's why we are where we are today.
One last question. Was there any evidence to suggest there was more than one shooter in Dignity Plaza that day?
There's an increasing amount. I should say there was an increasing amount for about the first 30 years after the assassination. I think we're kind of at a plateau now. I don't see a lot of new things coming out now. But between that day, when people who were standing on the railroad overpass pointed to the grassy knoll and said, "That's where I saw the shots coming from, that's where the puff of smoke came from, this is where I saw the guy running," that's the first thing. We had people running up the grassy knoll to see what was behind there, not going into the school book depository. All the way to the famous dictabelt that supposedly caught the sound of the shots, and the indication that 3 of the shots came from behind and 1 of the shots came from in front. There's lots of things. There's photographic evidence. There's a frame from the Orville Nix film that has been blown up and digitized that seems to show very clearly a man holding a rifle pointing it out to the street. I don't know the provenance of that digitization, and I haven't really researched it, but when I saw it, I basically, my jaw dropped, because if that in fact is what it is, that's our smoking gun.
Well, from what I hear, some of the local scuttlebutt on the street in Dallas, that some of the guns that were used, he was not going to get out of there alive. There was speculation as many as 6 shooters, but they all had silencers. But the one thing they couldn't silence is the smell of smoke, and lots of people have testified they smelled smoke. Oh,
it was very accurate that day, yeah. And again, Sam Holland, a railroad worker standing on top of the railroad overpass, who had been asked by a deputy sheriff that day to stand there to make sure people didn't throw things off or something happened. He was standing there in an official capacity watching things and looked up in the direction that he heard the shot coming from and saw the smoke at that time. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
And did he mysteriously die within a year or two? Or was that the man who? There was one man working in the parking lot that died in a one-car accident.
That actually, and I know exactly what you're talking about, but I can't call his name right now, but he was working in the tower. He was in the tower, so he actually was overlooking the grassy knoll from the other side. And so anything that happened there, like people running or people driving a car out, he would have seen. And once his presence was known and made clear that he had been a witness, you're right, he disappeared rather quickly.
Now, former CIA Director Dulles appears to be the weak link in the investigation, and in terms of a strong link that suggests he was covering up information. What's his motive? What do you think his motivation was for covering up?
Name one. If in fact it is true that organized crime, elements of American intelligence, and anti-Castro Cuban groups all came together maybe to assassinate the president, it makes sense only because they'd already been working together for years in the Kennedy administration doing things for the American government. That was the same group of people that tried to accomplish the Bay of Pigs. That was the same group of people that had been hired to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. So they were already working together. And so that, I don't know, that just seems to me to be an indication that you don't have to look very far for the answers that you're looking. Did that answer your question?
It did. One of the mobsters met with Joe Kennedy Sr. in 1960 and said, we will deliver all the votes you need in Texas and Chicago to win the race, because that's probably, even at the time, there was the polls were indicating a close race in those states.
Mm-hmm.
The deal was, that this is a theory, the deal was that you deliver the votes, and we'll get your casinos back in Havana. How strong a compelling story is that?
I think that is, if in fact that is true, and I don't know one way or another. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying I don't know. But if that were true, it's just one piece of the puzzle of the conundrum that Kennedy presented to people. If you remember, if you go back and look at his campaign speeches in 1960, if you look at what he said when he was on the floor of the Senate in the years leading up to that, he was a cold warrior. He would have been considered right-wing from that standpoint today. You read even his inaugural address, and he is out there, let's fight the forces of tyranny, let's light the lamp of liberty, let's torch be passed. People at that time had every reason to believe that he was going to be strong in the fight against communism in general and Cuba specifically. So if organized crime had some reason to believe that they had a favor owed or had control over or whatever the new administration, and I've heard that same theory that you talked about, if they had any indication whatsoever that they were owed favors, or even if not, they had good reason to believe that Kennedy was going to be tough on Castro and that he could be counted on to go in at the right moment and wipe out the Castro regime. And then he changed.
Right.
And then he changed.
And I agree with Mr. Kennedy. We shouldn't have invaded. Well, that's another story, but what I have heard is that one of those mobsters lost his son in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and that he was going to get the sons of Joe Kennedy for not coming through with the deal. Yeah, and that all makes sense from a Godfather's screenplay kind of thing, and it could have been the way it actually happened. You're not going to get anybody to come forward and say, I was there, I heard it, or anything like that. But, if it was commonly known, then it was probably, there was some truth to it. Unfortunately, like you say, they didn't take recordings of all these conversations.
Exactly.
And pictures of them together.
Right.
And secretaries with the taking notes. So we'll never know.
Right.
But nevertheless. Any other questions? Can you think of any?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
I'm happy to do it.